Hi everybody, welcome back to Profiles from the Titanic on the Horizon's Edge channel, where we take a look at the people who tragically lost their lives on board the Titanic back in 1912. And today, thanks to a suggestion, one of the other most requested people that you all wanted me to do a profile on, the last of the major officers on board the Titanic. I waited a little while before I got to him, and that is, of course, First Officer William Murdoch. You know, he played such a pivotal role. He was in charge of the Titanic. He was officer of the watch that night when the Titanic hit the iceberg. It was his orders that they tried to, turn and miss the iceberg, and all of that, everything that transpired with him at the bridge, on the bridge. And so he's a pivotal player in all of this. And not only that, but he's also perhaps the most controversial officer, maybe other than Captain Smith, because of the questions of, were there passengers shot? Did he commit suicide? And we do touch on that, okay? We will touch on that. We have to, because it's part of his story. But again, suggested by subscribers. Put that in the comment section if you want me to do a profile on somebody else, maybe somebody that is not too well known, right? We're trying to cover all the major people right now. But we'll be going off into other people that you may never have heard of before. But this one, I'm sure you have heard of him. First Officer William Murdoch. Please hit the subscribe and the like button. And thanks for watching Profiles from the Titanic. William McMaster Murdoch was born in 1873 in Galbady, Scotland. He came from a seafaring family. His grandfather and father were both captains, as well as 4 of his grandfather's brothers. He followed in his family's seafaring tradition when he apprenticed at a shipping company in 1887. Working his way up quickly, by 1896, he earned his master's certificate at age 23. In 1899, William Murdoch joined the White Star Line, serving as 4th officer on board the Medic, where he would make the Australian run along with fellow officer Charles Lightoller. Over the subsequent few years, Murdoch would make his way up to First Officer of the Celtic in 1904. He served in various roles and on different ships with the White Star Line. In 1907, he married Ada Banks. At this time, he became First Officer on the brand new Adriatic under Captain Edward John Smith. He would remain First Officer until May of 1911, when he would join the new Olympic, again under the command of Captain Smith. Not even a year later, Murdoch would then be assigned to yet another of White Star Line's newest ships, the RMS Titanic. Originally, Murdoch was appointed as Chief Officer of the Titanic. But just a few days before sailing, Captain Smith welcomed aboard Officer Henry Wilde as Chief Officer, causing Murdoch and Lightoller to shift down a position. Thus, William Murdoch became Titanic's First Officer instead. On the night of April 14th, Murdoch took over as officer of the watch at 10 p.m. He was to relieve Second Officer Lightoller, and his shift would last 4 hours, until 2 a.m. The temperature had dropped to 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the stars could be seen all the way down to the horizon. They were on the alert to watch for any signs of ice. At 11:40 p.m., 3 bells rang out sharply from the crow's nest. Lookout Frederick Fleet called the bridge, and 6th Officer James Moody repeated the warning to Murdoch, "Iceberg right ahead." Murdoch immediately called out the order to the quartermaster at the helm to turn the ship to port and put the engines to full stop. He then activated the watertight doors to seal all the bulkheads in the engine and boiler rooms. Within 15 seconds, all doors were shut. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the hull, but caused enough damage to breach 5 compartments. The Titanic was designed to float with as many as 4 rooms flooded, but not 5. At this point, the Titanic was doomed. Murdoch is perhaps the most controversial of all the officers on board the Titanic, save perhaps Captain Smith. His orders that night have come under intense scrutiny over the years. The order to turn the ship caused the iceberg to scrape along the side, causing enough damage to sink her. But at the same time, it also allowed the crew enough time to evacuate more than 700 people who ultimately survived. A more violent or direct collision could have had more catastrophic effects on the ship, possibly causing her to sink within minutes, thus killing every single person on board. Murdoch was then put in charge by Captain Smith of organizing the passengers and crew for evacuation to the lifeboats. He was then to oversee the launching of the lifeboats on the starboard side of the ship. Overall, he was somewhat successful in getting people into the boats. It is said that 61% of all people who survived did so from the starboard side of the ship. This was perhaps due to the fact that Murdoch allowed men into the boats once all women and children were loaded at each lifeboat. At approximately 1:15 a.m., Chief Officer Wilde distributed revolvers to himself, Lightoller, and Murdoch just in case. This would ultimately lead to the other and perhaps biggest controversy of the Titanic story. Did an officer commit suicide? But in the meantime, the evacuation continued. By 1:50 a.m., all lifeboats on the starboard side were launched, with the exception of the two collapsibles A and C. At collapsible C, men began to rush the boat. There were reports of warning shots fired, perhaps by First Officer Murdoch. It was in this boat that White Star President J. Bruce Ismay escaped. It was launched at 2 a.m., just 20 minutes before the end. Work then commenced on collapsible A, the final boat. Witnesses say that Murdoch was there, helping to get the boat ready, when at about 2:15, the waves washed it off the deck and it floated free. First Officer William Murdoch was never seen again. His body was never found. However, by the time the Carpathia reached New York, there were already stories circulating about a shooting on board the Titanic. Some witnesses said that perhaps some passengers were shot and that possibly one officer turned the gun on himself. One name was mentioned more than any other: William Murdoch. While there is truth to the fact that shots were fired on board during the loading of several of the lifeboats, there is conflicting evidence of an officer suicide. The issue is too voluminous to cover here, but you can read all of the eyewitness testimonies for yourself, both for and against the supposed suicide of William Murdoch. One conclusion that most researchers reach, however, is that despite the conflicting evidence and all the stories, we will probably never know for sure exactly what happened to First Officer William Murdoch in those last few chaotic minutes. His wife Ada inherited his estate and by 1917 moved back to her native New Zealand. She never remarried. She died in 1941 at the age of 65. They never had any children. Thanks for watching Profiles from the Titanic.